Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer. Again, we are still dealing with the climate emergency, the heat emergency that the globe is already warming at a time where over 8 years ago, when climate scientists were warning that America and the world has about 10 years to act, we're 2 years shy of that 10 years, and the heat effects and the impacts are accelerating, and the intensity and the climate disruption is here. And right now, given this crisis and giving this warning that we must act, none other than my guest, Serge Abergel, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Hydro-Quebec Emergency Energy Services out of Canada. He is the perfect person to talk about the crisis that we're facing right now, but more importantly, what are we doing and what can we do to mitigate and offset, if not hold it, at least make sure it doesn't get worse. Serge, welcome to News, Views, and Interviews, and we are delighted to have you.
Aaron, thanks for having me. You know what? It's a very troubling time right now. I am losing track of the number of warnings, weather warnings, smoke warnings, flood warnings that we are seeing on both sides of the border, both in Quebec, Canada, and in New York State, and even here. I'm here today in Burlington, and they've had major flooding. So this climate urgency is now in front of us. We are seeing it. People are feeling it. It's extremely hot here as well, and we're quite north. And so what do we do? And this is a question that we're all asking ourselves. What can we do? How can we go faster? I think maybe come back to the basics. It's important to look at the solutions that we have that are already here, that are proven, that are generating clean power, both in Quebec right now. Hydropower that we have in Quebec, we're blessed with a lot of water and the topography to produce hydropower, and other renewable sources throughout the Northeast. But we have the solution to this issue. The problem that we're facing right now is more of a human problem. Is how do we make change happen?
And this is the fundamental point. You know, again, Hydro-Quebec is the world's, and then actually the northern hemisphere of the Americas leading source of zero energy through hydropower. Why don't we talk a little bit about that and what does it mean? And is there anything comparable in this hemisphere that's already at scale that can impact the growing demands for energy?
So, you know, probably important to go back to Hydro-Quebec it's a very unique company in the sense that it's a public utility.
Okay.
So it belongs to the people of Quebec.
Okay.
The reason it was created in 1944 was to bring available, affordable, and reliable power to the people of Quebec, because at that time they didn't have that.
Right.
The luck they had back then was that the power that they were generating and the new facilities that they were building were hydropower, because that's what they knew, that's what they had, and
everybody knows about Niagara Falls. Everybody knows about the Westinghouse plants at Niagara Falls, the great battle between Westinghouse and Consolidated Edison. And that technology is not burning stuff, but, you know, it's another means using natural resources. Again, the Canadian side, it's government run, but on the American side, privatized. But it's a very sound system by which one produces energy. So continue.
So you produce energy with water. The water flows down the river. You set up an infrastructure, a dam. You set up a turbine on the dam, and the water turns the turbine, and you essentially produce electricity, which you then deliver through transmission lines. And so, you know, through times, Quebec built 62 generating stations, enough to produce enough energy to cover the needs of 8 million Quebecers and about 3 million folks that live in our surrounding areas, like New York, like New England. And so a lot of renewable power available on demand not when it's windy or when it's sunny. That's still good, but this power is, as long as the river flows, you can produce power. And
Let
in
me
some
ask you.
cases, we have reservoirs as well.
Yeah, let me ask you a fundamental question, because since it's a public utility, so the public's already invested the tax dollars to create this utility. Unlike a private sector that's making a profit or recovering costs, a public utility, the government can absolutely set the rates. And so, are the rates in Quebec, out of all the provinces, some of the most affordable in Canada or the Northeast?
So this is interesting. So the rates are the lowest in North America.
Okay.
But I want to correct maybe one thing you said, which will bring some insight as to models that we may want to follow elsewhere. Quebecers, the taxpayers never put money into Hydro-Quebec.
Okay.
The way the model was set up was you borrow money on the markets and you build these installations. Because these installations live over 100 years, you pay them off and they keep producing power. Therefore, on the long runs, your rates are cheap. And so they were lucky because only hydropower has that capacity, because the installations are essentially, the dams are made of big rocks.
Right.
And you can imagine rocks don't fall apart. So they stay there for hundreds of years. And so if you maintain it properly, you have an asset that gives back clean power to the people at very, very affordable prices for decades to come. And that's the gift that keeps giving here.
And not only that, since this was begun back in the 1940s, the cost of dollars versus now, over time, it's like, as they say, when you invest with the cheapest amount of money, over time, when money becomes expensive, it's actually, the genius in it is that, the people are not shocked with spiking bills or utilities like National Grid or other entities that are demanding rate increases every 2 or 3 years because of fuel mix. This is water. This was a sound, good government decision, and like I said, it's a rarity. You're in on the ground floor, and it's absolutely a very powerful public good, because over time, it's not adding to the financial burden that the public has to endure.
And this is all about renewables in general. The more you have renewables providing energy for your areas, the more your rates are stable, because you're not buying fossil fuel. And so it's a simple mix. You get rid of fossil fuel at some point, if you can, how you can, and we need to, obviously. You have stable rates. You have they're stable through time. They tend to stay low. They don't spike when there's a war somewhere, because you're not buying anything.
Right.
So
you have true in the case of Quebec versus the other provinces, you have true energy independence.
You do, but then you start to think there's different types of renewables. There's hydropower, which is a very valuable asset because it's always available, right?
Right.
But you have a certain quantity of water, so you want to use that water as wisely as you can because it's precious. And then you have other renewables, wind, solar. Those are what we call intermittent, because there's not always sun, there's not always wind.
Right.
And so they run a certain percentage of the time, 40%, 35%, whatever. So when you mix wind or solar with hydropower, there you have a really nice combination, because you can use your water a little less. You can use it when you really need it. When there's no wind, you fill your gaps and you have available clean power. And so that's being smart. And when you think of the border between countries, between states, Canada, US, the best we can do right now to optimize how we work together is to work across the border, so we can take advantage of our strengths. So we have hydropower in the US, there's a lot of wind. That for us is very, very interesting.
Because one of the things that we struggle with is that clean energy mix. And so hydro, geothermal, solar, and wind are key assets. And one of the things you gave a talk about the Northeast corridor, and I'm going to try to squeeze it in this 1 minute. What is the energy mix for the Northeast corridor, which is basically eastern Canada and the northeast of the United States? What is our major mix here?
Well, if you take New York City, the big consumption of energy, say New York City, you're essentially 90% fossil fuel right now, or more. So you're really heavily dependent on polluting energy that impacts the communities that are all around. In Quebec, on the opposite, you're almost 100% hydropower, so you're renewable. So those are two different worlds.
So, because I mean, this is really, really critical, because right now we're having that conversation, and two things are happening. We're getting a lot of smoke because the climate destabilization in Canada. But look here, I tell you what, we got to take a commercial, and we will pick this up right the next half. Again, Sunday morning news, views, and interviews with Serge Abergel of Hydro Quebec, and as we say, Hydro Quebec and Champlain Hudson Power Express. We'll be right back in a moment. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Your host, Aaron Mayer, and our guest, Serge Abergel of Hydro Quebec, and the COO and operator of the big project that's coming to New York, which is Champlain Hudson Power Express. Here's a man that's connecting New York and Canada in one of the Northeast and the Northern Hemisphere's largest clean energy projects. I call proven clean energy projects with regards to hydropower to New York City. We were talking about the impacts right now that are facing us right now of the worsening effects of climate change, because with that is climate destabilizations. Areas that were temperate are drying out, and as a consequence of them drying out over the past few years, normal lightning strikes during storms are starting forest fires in western United States as well as Canada. We're right now seeing the effects of millions of acres burning, which also adds to more particulate matter that is trapping more sun energy, solar energy, but also the health consequences. There's health consequences related to heat, health consequences related to, as they say, the downpours, the atmospheric oceans that we're experiencing, and the rains. And right now, we must act on climate. And the state of New York is basically connecting to this energy, this asset, so it can meet its 20 by 30 goals of being over 40% with regards to clean energy. But clearly, we may meet that goal, but do we need to do more? And then here's the secondary part of the question, Serge, is there capacity, given New York State energy demand, especially metropolitan New York City? Is there capacity, if more energy is needed, for Hydro Quebec, to supply that energy?
Well, first off, it's important to recognize that New York has taken a leadership role in terms of,
absolutely,
I would say a bold move to sign a contract with Hydro Quebec.
Okay,
to bring power.
How is that? But how is that pioneering? Why is that important right now?
Look, when you look at your 2030 goals, you need to be 70% renewable energy on your grid by 2030. The situation is simple. The upstate part of New York is essentially, call it 90%, 80% renewable. When you look at the city part, you're mostly fossil fuel, past Albany.
Right.
And how do you get the clean power to get all the way to the south, where it matters the most, I would say, because that's where you're dependent on fossil fuel. That's where people are hit by the effects of localized air pollutants and so on. And, obviously, if you don't get the power to that southern part of the state, the city, you are not reaching your 70 by 30 goals. And you're not going to get there. So the state went through what they call a Tier 4 process. 2 major contracts were given after that.
Mm-hmm.
One's Clean Path New York. The other one was Champlain Hudson Power Express, bring hydropower from Quebec all the way to the city.
What's the difference between those two projects?
Well, fundamentally, I mean, one is essentially connecting Hydro-Quebec's generating stations to New York, the city.
Okay.
Okay, so 62 generating stations in Quebec with all that excess capacity right to the city. Clean Path, on the other hand, is, at a high level, it's in-state resources, so it's a different mix, renewables as well. There's intermittence, there's some hydro in there. Essentially connects resources that are within New York State, mostly the upstate area, all the way to the city through this new infrastructure as well.
Well, we don't have big dams. We don't have a Grand Coulee Dam in New York State, nor do we have the dam and water capacity that Quebec has. But what I believe that big difference is they're relying on the intermittent sources of wind and solar. And so while they are adding to the case mix, New York City, because it is the financial capital of the world, it needs on-demand, clear energy. It cannot afford peaks and troughs.
That's right. And I would say, like most people, you want to make sure you have power all the time. You don't want power half your day, right? So this is where hydropower is interesting, because you're injecting some very, very reliable energy into the grid that is not intermittent. Therefore, you are, the combination of this hydropower with other intermittent sources, and at some point with offshore wind that is being built up around New York, will give a very, I would say, an optimized mix, because then you have both renewables that are intermittent, you have both hydropower. Therefore, I would think you're maxing what you can cover in terms of clean energy out of your 24-hour day.
Now, I'm not going to get you in trouble by saying this something heresy. Something I don't think it's heresy, but I just think the things I'm going to say, because one of the fights that I've been active in is the fight against nuclear energy, because I don't consider it a dirty fuel. While it may produce steam, the fuels for nuclear are highly hazardous in the lifespan of those fuels and their waste product. The harvesting and the waste product are measured in millions of years of risk and threat, and that you can't go near them. So to me, a clean fuel is a clean fuel. Like hydro, there is no waste. I mean, there's other than you get wet, the last, or you fall into some water. Yeah, you got a risk. But
you don't want to fall into it.
Right. But one of the things I worked on with regards to Indian Point, which was a major supplier to New York City, was it shutting down because it was not a clean energy source. In my opinion, I grew up in the shadow of Indian Point and always felt the threat. I swam in the Hudson River there and probably was bathed with irradiated water. But the other thing I fought against is fossil fuels of natural gas. I'm glad that you mentioned earlier, New York City is heavily dependent, 90%, on climate-killing fossil fuels. And if we're going to stop the big suppliers of dirty fuel and dirty energy that right now powers New York City, we have to, if we're going to meet the 2030 goals and 2050 goals, if we're going to shut those power sources off so that we can have clean energy, we have to meet that demand. And right now we've got a portfolio of solar, wind, and geothermal. But right now, the other ace in the hole is where Hydro-Quebec, Champlain Hudson Power Express really comes in to that void. Can you talk about the distance of the cable and what that cable is going to be basically pulling in and how that's going to be feeding the power needs and energy needs of New York City?
Sure. So if you go all the way from the start point of this line, is the Hertel substation, which is located slightly south of Montreal. Those that have driven down to Montreal, you cross over on Highway 87, Highway 15 on the Quebec side, cross the border. It's maybe 30 miles that way. So total distance from start to end, and essentially from that Hertel substation all the way to Astoria, Queens, where the line lands, is roughly 370 miles. of essentially underground cable, two cables that are about the size of 6 inches in diameter, like about this big, and they follow Lake Champlain under the water, under about 6, 7 feet underground, the bottom of the lake. Follow the Hudson River. There's certain instances where they come out of the river, they go underground, and they come back into the river. And the reason is simple. That's just to avoid areas that were heavily polluted by industrial users way back in the days. And so we don't want to mix these pollutants. So a very cautious approach, complex to build because, you can imagine you're burying these two cables over almost 400 miles. And so these two cables will bring enough energy to power 1 million homes in New York City. Wow. So that's a lot of power. 1 million homes is a lot of power.
Yes.
And it'll reduce localized air pollutants around the city. I was mentioning that before. There's these fossil fuel peakers around New York City that are not enough.
Yeah, these peaker plants basically meet as they spike demand needs, and they burn natural gas, and they produce a lot of climate killing, as I say, greenhouse gases.
They do, and they've been localized in neighborhoods that have been heavily impacted by pollution, disadvantaged communities. So they set them up there in the days, I guess because I'm not 100% sure why they set them up there, but I'm guessing because it was easiest to go there because these people, wouldn't say anything. And so when they turn them on and they burn either, gas or oil, especially oil, the pollution goes back down into the neighborhoods. That's how the wind just pushes it away from the city, down into those neighborhoods in Queens and Bronx and Brooklyn. And, those folks are heavily impacted.
Right. Again, these fossil fuels are clear public health risk. The particulates are major sources of asthma and asthma attack. These communities have been complaining since our first Environmental Bond Act in New York State to clean these plants up. But look, we got to get a commercial in right now, but we're going to pick up the EJ portion of this in the next segment. We'll be right back. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. Our guest, Serge. As I said, I'm just so excited that you're here. Abergel of Hydro-Quebec, and we're talking about the big project that is again part of the CLCPA, the biggest clean energy project in the United States in the hemisphere, in partnership with Canada, called the Champlain Hudson Power Express. It is, as they say, once this project goes online, I just think it's going to be expanded, hopefully, to meet the needs of almost all of New England. And as they say, help us get toward the goal of shutting down and minimizing our dependency upon fossil fuels. When we went to the commercial break, we were talking about the localized impacts, the environmental justice impacts on communities. And one of the things that the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act does is not only push for clean energy and help us meet our goal of 40% clean energy, but also the immediate benefits to communities, because as we shut down these peaker plants, as you mentioned, we start to reduce some of the EJ risk and threats, but also talk a little bit about the public health impacts. But how else also is, Chippy and Hydro-Quebec engaging disempowered communities, and start with from the First Nations, the Mohawk Nations, all the way down to frontline communities down in New York City?
Okay, so there's a lot to cover in this question. I mean, the first one is you're reducing the use of fossil fuel peakers all around the city. So localized air pollutants are going to go down, especially when it's very cold or it's very, very hot when you use these facilities. Therefore, the pollution impact on the folks that live right there in Asthma Alley and all around these social housings in New York, it is going to go down. It's going to improve, in other words, less impact. Now, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it's like removing about 44% or half the cars in New York City. It's the equivalent of removing the emissions from all these cars. So that's huge from a fighting climate change perspective. Now, just coming back to how to accomplish one of these projects, how to be in the modern era today, facing climate change. How do we make sure we build these projects that are needed? Because to transition, you need to build things. It's impossible. You don't transition by keeping things as they are today. If not, we keep burning fuels, and we know what happens. So how do we build things? And the way to build things is to work with communities, to engage with community partners, whether it's the disadvantaged communities that are in the neighborhoods that are impacted by pollution, whether it's communities, First Nation communities in Quebec, that on whose land this line will be passing, and to engage, have conversation with these people. And at the end, it's interesting, when we work together, we exchange and we explain this project, we explain what it will do in terms of reducing pollution. People are pragmatic. People are looking for a way to make this work. And so we had great partners in the city because they recognize the climate impact and they recognize our willingness to engage with them through different initiatives. We'll talk about that after, but that's very important to us, to be a community first partner, to give back to the communities, to bring value to the people that are receiving this power. This is not just a transaction. And then on the Quebec side, to modernize the way we do things with our First Nations partners. We are, the Quebec side, we have an equity partner in the line. Grand Chief Sky Deer from the Mohawk community. The Mohawk community is located south of Montreal. They are our partner on the transmission line in Quebec. They're sitting at the table with us. They've invested and they will get a return on this investment. And so that's important too, in terms of.
But there's another fun fact. It's also the lands that it's going through from Canada all the way through at least the Catskill are Mohawk ancestral lands. So it's very powerful that you're making this connection. Go ahead.
It's powerful, Aaron, and it's also powerful from the standpoint that the Mohawks of Ganawage in Montreal were also the ones that built the skyscrapers in New York City. Because they have they are able to work in very tall
high altitudes.
That's right. Where you and I would be paralyzed with fear, they just do their work, and so there were steel workers. They were very comfortable in this. So there's a close relationship between the Mohawk community in New York City, and this, in some sense, is a continuation of that. It's this close relationship that's evolving into this energy transition. And so, coming back to the point that how do we accomplish these projects? We accomplish them by being inclusive. The companies like ours that have maybe a different DNA because we're a public utility, we engage with the communities and we give back to them.
I also met some of your principals. I met, some of the leaders of the Quebec government, and very strong, are what are the impacts and how are we pulling in the voices of the community? I mean, a lot of corporations hire consultants and other people to push communities out of the way. But the leaders I've seen, with the delegation are concerned about workforce development, are concerned not only about the health benefits, but basically reducing harm, but as much engagement as possible. That it's like an all hands on deck approach, but a deeper level of respect toward the communities and making sure that they do benefit.
There's a realization, I think, from years and years of working in energy at Hydro-Quebec and probably in Quebec at a greater level, that you can't succeed unless you work in collaboration. And this is the approach that the companies had in Quebec for many years. It wasn't always like that. I don't want to say it's always been perfect. It's not. But it's evolved. And that's what's important to that, because you can't. Things are changing. Climate change is so different than anything we face. We need to evolve also. So in 2023, more than ever, being inclusive, being engaging with our First Nation partners, resolving past grievances, recognizing past wrongs and fixing them, and making things as good as you can. It doesn't mean you fix everything. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but there's a willingness to go above and beyond, and to revisit things that were done in a certain way by a very conservative industry that thought that it wasn't that it didn't have to talk to anyone.
Right. It's a very powerful point, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because I was part of that battle 15 and 20 years ago against Hydro-Quebec and pushing for Indigenous rights from an EJ perspective. And it's interesting because, again, you're dealing with government politics, conservatives versus liberals. And, under the current Trudeau administration, there's been that reconciliation. I mean, there's that recognition of all people's rights and all people's humanity. And I think that at a national level, that's happening in Canada. Conversations that did not happen just a decade and a half ago under conservative administrators didn't. But it's not just the national government, but even the state governments, like Quebec, recognizing the pain and then saying, listen, we cannot, deal with what we did back in 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970. But what we do now matters. And the fact that you brokered the relationship and you're coming in as partners, a business partner with the Mohawk Nation, that's a very powerful piece. But the other thing is that I've also been with you folks on your outreach to communities, the workforce development outreach, bringing in Hispanic leader groups, labor groups, Caribbean labor groups in metropolitan New York City, workshops, bringing those workforces and those who are workforce development experts to the table, because there are going to be jobs created by this. And so you've been leading in that space. And to me, it's not a question of apologetics to get the contract, but it's just the way that you guys are doing business now. No,
it is, but for New York, we set up a green economy fund.
Okay,
$40 million that's been set up for green job training.
You said 4 million or 4? You said 4 million
40.
or 40 million?
40.
Okay, I said okay, 40. Okay, now we're talking about it.
$40 million, and I've got a cold there, and so I'm sorry. It's not clear, but it's so. It's a recognition that this transmission line will be built in the next, in service May 2026. So that's, we're in 2023. So next 3 years, this line is going to be built. But what do we leave after as a legacy for those communities all along this line? Green job trainings is not something that happens overnight. So we set up this fund with an advisory board that's comprised of workforce development experts and community leaders all along the line from north to south. And the whole goal of this Green Economy Fund is to leave a legacy that goes beyond the construction of this line. Again, not being transactional. Set up communities so that they have something to benefit from years after you're gone, years after this line is built.
And with that, I want you to hold that thought. We got to get this commercial in for the last segment. Again, Serge Abergel of Hydro-Quebec. This is a very powerful conversation on clean energy response, but also in response to our current climate crisis and climate disruption, the need for clean energy. Again, we'll be right back. Sunday morning news, views, and interviews. And final segment, we're here. Our guest, Serge Abergel of Hydro-Quebec, who is the key lead, number one man and leader on, as they say, a project that includes Canada and New York State as part of the CLCPA agreement and contract to deliver clean energy to the great state of New York. Again, final segments, we've covered a lot of ground, and I know that we won't cover it all, but right now, we're seeing that climate crisis is the sense of urgency right now, because again, we're behind the 8 ball. This project should have been done 10, maybe 20 years ago. The next question is, the capacity. And in order for us to decarbonize, our country, decarbonize our economy, is there capacity, for the populations of the Northeast, from Maine, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, in conjunction, and is there the bandwidth to bring these other regions and other economies into hydro power?
So Aaron, when we set out, I'd say almost 10 years ago, we had the ambition to build two new large infrastructure to transport energy from Quebec to the US. We had the Champlain Hudson Power Express. It took a long time, but we're getting it done. And we had a different project in New England. It's called the New England Clean Energy Connect. And that project is also underway and it's being done. They're both about enough energy for 1 million homes each. And that was the extent of our ambition. Keep in mind, we had not been able to do anything or built anything for the 30 years prior to that. So these two projects are being built. They're going to flow large quantities of energy north to south, and they're going to help the transition, as you mentioned. As we look at the future, what is the best way for us to optimize our networks? And the answer to that, in our view, is different now. Because we're seeing a lot of intermittent resources. We're seeing a lot of wind power and solar power being built up all across the Northeast. It's more about being smart with what we have and taking advantage of our mutual strengths. And so by mutual strength, I mean, you guys in New York and around are building up a lot of wind resources. And, there will be times when you have too much. There's going to be surplus power. And what happens right now when there's surplus power in certain areas is you do what's called curtailment, which means you waste it. You don't use it. Because the grid always has to be balanced, offer and demand. So therefore, if you have enough transmission lines and you have surplus power at certain times, you can flow it back to Quebec because we can close our dams. We don't have to let the water go through our turbines. We can just pause, use your excess wind power so we optimize. We're being smarter. And then when you don't have wind, then we reverse the lines and we flow back the power towards the US because hydropower is available on demand.
Okay. So the question is that you want to talk about smart grids and we still have 1920s and 1930s telephone poles and infrastructure. And I know that we've given tax incentives to the big national utility monopolies and international monopolies like National Grid. And the question is, are the grids ready for the clean energy boom that's coming and capacity so that it's able to do that handshake of moving energy from point A to point B to point C?
Well, overall, okay, when you look at the grids, wherever you look in the US, the grids will need investment in order to transition. So it's not the pretty answer, but the real answer is we have an aging infrastructure in the country. And, for years and years, it's heavily built up in the 60s and 70s or whatever, but today it's an aging infrastructure. And so it needs to be replaced, it needs to be built up. And so the general answer to your question is there will need to be investment. We will not transition without building anything. And so I always get a sense of frustration and disappointment when I hear certain groups that say, don't build this, don't build that, don't put wind farms here, don't bring transmission lines. If you don't build anything, there's no transition. It's simple.
But more importantly, the climate realities of us failing to act in a timely and rational way. As you know me, past national president of the Sierra Club, I have been bullish since Paris at the Council of Party various conferences and summits, the global summits on clean energy and the need to act on climate. And, there are a lot of times we're in those rooms arguing when we thought we had time to to, as I say, a la carte pick solutions. But those days are gone. Climate disruption is here now. Now we need to act. So we're at a period in time where we are seeing the greatest existential threat to all creation on the planet right now. So the days of debate and thinking that we had time to pick and choose what solution is going to work, now we're at the general alarm where we must now pull every single asset to basically do what we can to shut down the burning of fossil fuels. And there's right now a massive carbon feedback loop that we've already gotten into because the North Pole is off gassing a lot of methane from, a lot of the permafrost as the thawing out. Areas that used to be frozen year round are now having temperature spikes in northern China in the 90s. So we now must act. And so the question becomes, how do we act in a responsible and rational way? One of the things you had mentioned is that you looked at how we produced hydro electricity in the past. And so we're looking at just relationships and partnerships. So as we start to grow in this demand and need, so will that also mean pulling in broader conversation with indigenous folks? How do we get more power on demand? Because clearly this is not enough. We're going to need more.
We are going to need more, and we are going to need leadership in order to move things along faster. I think the example of New York is cause for optimism in a sense, because there has been leadership at the state level, and we have a model now. We know how we can do this. We're not waiting for new technology. We're not waiting for something. We have a way forward, and it's proven successful. And we know that the best way to get there as soon as possible is to work together. Communities across the border working together, showing leadership, and getting involved. And so I come back to this, but we're not reinventing the wheels. We know how to get it done. We just need to get it done quicker is what we need right now.
Closing thought. You're a father with a young family, and we already know what's going to happen in our lifetime. The worst effects are going to be happening in the lifetime of your children. What does it mean for you to be at this place in space right now, trying to do the best you can for your children and ensuring them a less hot Earth, as they say, future, and hopefully one that's salvageable for them? What does it mean to you and for that next generation?
I think, Aaron, as we take on these fights, because literally it's fights at times, we face adversity, and we keep at it, right? It's always been a fight, and it's always been, in my view, it's always been, there is success at the end, but it's through adversity. And this transition requires all of us to keep going at it, because we don't have a choice. We can't say, who cares? And so just stubbornly keep at it. Do everything you can. Resist, push back on those people that say, don't change, don't do anything. Change is bad. No, we need change. We need to build things. We need courage. And we need everyone to look at facts, not ideology, not, politics, or this is about facts. This science of global warming is just science, it's facts. It's when you're sick, you go to a hospital, you consult a doctor. Well, this is the same thing. And so facts matter. And I think my only advice, and hopefully that's, to my kids, is they get what they get out of this is they see we keep going.
Well, I think they're going to see a little bit more. They're going to see their father being one of the leaders at a time when humanity needed leaders to stand up and help our nations and help our peoples and help the planet. And I can say this, they will probably have a smile no matter what, to know that at this hour, when humanity needed action the most. Their dad, Serge Abergel of Quebec, was standing at the pinnacle of trying to save humanity. Brother, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us and enlightening our leaders and our listeners, and not only here on this channel, but those who will look around the world. I hope folks that they go to the Chippy Express link there so they can look at the project and the work that you guys are doing and the collaboration with First Nations like the Mohawk Nation. Again, Serge, thank you for your time and thank you for joining us and thank you for informing our listeners.
Aaron, thank you so much. Always nice talking to you.